I'm very excited to introduce our next panel. I will tell you the moderator of the panel, the first time that I met Lisa Monaco, I thought, wow, if I were president, that's the person I would want worrying about cybersecurity and national security. I didn't say that out loud because we had just met, but that's what I was thinking. And I'm very excited to have Lisa here with us at NYU as a distinguished senior fellow with the Center for Cybersecurity and our former Homeland Security and Counterterrorism Advisor to President Obama. Joined with Lisa, we have an esteemed and terrific panel, who Lisa will introduce. And I just thank you all for making time for us today on the very important and sometimes tricky and challenging issue of cybersecurity and government relations.
Thanks very much, Judy. It's great to be here. And thanks, folks, for attending what I think has been a terrific day so far, and I hope to continue that with this discussion today. I'm going to introduce our panel in a second. I think, the organizers, Judy and the team at the center, Sarvanaz, Claire, Alex, all you guys should be given great credit for bringing together a wonderful series of discussions. And this panel, Cybersecurity and Government Relations, will not be a discussion about how to lobby your government, but hopefully some lessons from a wonderful set of people who have a vast amount of experience both inside government and in the private sector, and in a series of partnerships, public and private partnerships, which I think are really, really important. So I hope we can extract a number of good insights and lessons about how we can advance what I personally think is a very critical area of making progress on cybersecurity issues, and that is partnership and productive relationships and interactions between the public and the private sector. Particularly at a time when, frankly, distrust of institutions is very high. And at a time when data and privacy issues are growing in the public consciousness, in the consciousness of boardrooms, and certainly in our public policy issues. The private sector is coming under increasing scrutiny in terms of how they handle data, and in some areas skepticism, and we'll get to some of that with the panel today. It used to be a province, skepticism that is uniquely reserved for the government, so everyone I think is getting into the game. I saw some polling data recently that I thought was a very good scene setter for today's discussion. A recent poll that was done by PwC, and this really struck me, 25%, only 25% of the respondents to this poll believe that companies handle data responsibly, which I thought was a very interesting result. And 85% of consumers won't do business with a company if they're concerned about how they handle data and if they're concerned about their security practices. So that just puts, I think, in very stark relief the importance of how both government and the private sector come at these issues. So without any further ado, let me introduce our terrific panel, and I'm going to go just kind of straight down the line here. Immediately to my left is Amanda Craig, Senior Cybersecurity Strategist, which by the way is a great title, at Microsoft, and is part of their global cybersecurity and public policy team. I will say, I think I've worked with folks from Microsoft, both when I was in government and now since I've been outside, and particular area of thought leadership going on by Brad Smith, obviously the president now of Microsoft, around cybersecurity issues and particularly in the area of setting global cyber norms. And so I think that'll be a really important area for us to talk about. So we're really glad to have Amanda with us. Next to her is Jennifer Detrani, the General Counsel and Associate Founder of Wickr. Folks will know, hopefully because you've got the app on your phone, which I'm sure Jen will talk to you about. really interesting company and obviously service in the growing area of peer-to-peer and secure messaging systems. Jen comes to this, as most of our panelists do, with a background also in government service. She served as a prosecutor in the U.S. Attorney's Office in California, correct?
Correct. Yep. San Diego.
In San Diego. Also practiced corporate law at Cooley and did a stint in private practice also as a solo practitioner, so comes with a breadth of experience on these issues. Next to her is Phyllis Schneck, who is Managing Director and Global Leader of Cyber Solutions at Promontory, which is a company that is part of IBM. Hopefully I got that correct, providing cybersecurity solutions. She is also a member of the Aspen Cybersecurity Group, which I co-chair with Ginny Rometty from IBM and Congressman Will Hurd, and is a very valued member of that group, a bipartisan group looking to make advances and advance the dialogue on cybersecurity issues. Prior to Promontory, though, Phyllis served as the Deputy Undersecretary for Cybersecurity and Communications at the Department of Homeland Security, where I spent many hours with Phyllis in the Situation Room at the White House, dealing with, amongst other issues, things like cybersecurity legislation, small matters like the OPM hack, and other issues of the day. She has been, and was at the time at DHS, a key leader on strengthening protections, particularly for our critical infrastructure, and working across government and with the private sector, particularly when it comes to applying technology and things like identifying signatures to help DHS protect civilian agencies, which is obviously very foremost in its mission set. She's got an extensive background in the private sector as well, and in executing on public-private partnerships in a prior life as CTO of McAfee and as an advisor on numerous governmental and non-governmental bodies. So that's an area I think both on the panel and when we get to questions that you may want to probe with Phyllis. And then finally, last but not least, Beth George at the end of our table here, who is currently of counsel at the law firm Wilson, Sonsini, Goodrich, and Rosati in the San Francisco office there. Her practice is wide-ranging in representing companies in complex cybersecurity and data security matters, to include responding to breaches and advising clients on internal as well as governmental investigations, on privacy and compliance issues, and responding to law enforcement. Her practice also includes a range of national security matters, to include CFIUS and other matters. And she comes to that, I can say from personal experience, with a great deal of expertise. She also draws on a breadth of government experience, serving. I think she may get the most points for her trip around the executive branch of the federal government, serving as Deputy General Counsel at the Department of Defense, Associate White House Counsel, where she also spent some time in the Situation Room on the OPM hack, I would note, and as counsel to the then Assistant Attorney General of the National Security Division at the Justice Department, yours truly, on policy and intelligence matters. So it is great to have her also at this table, and a real pleasure for me to get to be reunited with a few of my former government colleagues. So welcome, one and all. Hopefully that'll be the most talking I do during this panel. I want to start, though, given that we've got a group of experts here who now are all in the private sector, but all, to a great degree, have drawn also on their government experience. I think we ought to start with a bit of a baseline on what the threat is and what you and your clients are most concerned about. So I think what I'd like to do is start, maybe I'll start with you, Phyllis, on this issue of threat. What do you think is the greatest challenge that you now see in terms of the cybersecurity threat, and what is, and if perhaps it hasn't, but has it changed? How has that perspective changed for you now that you're sitting in the private sector seat versus when you occupied all that time at the NCIC at DHS?
So that's the whole panel then? That's the hour-long question?
Yeah,
So
in
good
30
afternoon.
seconds or less.
Thank you very much, and thank you to Judy and to Lisa and to all of you for being here. You're the future, right? You're going to help decide how we solve these problems. And as you grow into the field of law, I'm sitting among them, you're going to help people understand, look, we can't prevent any of this. So I'll answer the question really easily. The cyber threat just gets worse. As computing power gets better, really fast, the adversaries get better at using that. We can't prevent it. We can be resilient. We can act well under attack. And we can help make more creative law and policy that helps us act with the agility that right now our adversaries have no lawyers. No offense, but they work better because of it. And they have plenty of money. That's what we're up against. So what I see and what I saw inside is the most virulent threat that we have is the one that combines the cyber and the physical. Right, so whether it's, and the OPM hack in many ways was that too, because those are human beings, that's their information, that's their life in a form. But things that look at our biotech data, the genomic data, you spit in a bag to find out if you're Italian. Where is that data going? Who's handling it? How is it protected? Who has access to it? You think about what keeps the lights on. We talked a lot about this in government. There are evil people that have embedded themselves all over the grid just to hang out, but we allowed it. So what are we going to do in the future to look at how do these computers that are enabling everything we do, how are we going to start to lock that down, but not in the traditional sense, but really look at going forward, your devices are getting smaller and smaller. You'll be able to eat cyber stuff soon. How do you, it'll happen. How do you make sure that those things are making detectable choices so that when it makes a wrong choice, we have control over the outcome. It's not about preventing it. You know, I think the perspective coming out of government, coming in government, you see 24/7, as everybody here knows, the bad shower coming at you. And we used to joke, we called it cleanup on aisle 9. You need to handle that and make agencies run again and help private sector run again and share the right information to cure the disease and build the immune system. On the outside, I see in the banking systems, the financial sector, two things. One is they care a lot about cybersecurity because they understand that if you lose that, you lose trust, and that's your global financial system. They also understand that the energy grid that underrides all that is also very vulnerable, and so they care a lot because that keeps your information flowing, that keeps money flowing. But secondly, they are now looking at all the new computer science and math and cryptocurrency and blockchain and name that buzzword, and that all runs on fast computing, which all runs on electricity, and that's all very vulnerable. So what I see on the outside is what people don't see. They hear the threat, they buy some products, but they don't start at the top and say, what's my real risk? What am I worried about? And what am I willing to do and share with my colleagues and my government to make sure that I can respond to this?
Great. Beth, anything to add in terms of the threat picture that you're seeing on the outside and compare it to what you saw inside government?
Sure. So I think what I would, I think the piece that I would sort of add is the breadth of the issue is so great, and like it's so broad. Listening to Phyllis talk, it's not where my brain had gone when I thought about the threat picture, and I think that's telling you something about how different and how big this issue is, right? So I worked in government in national security, and I was particularly focused on activities by nation-state actors or individuals acting on behalf of nation-states. And particularly intellectual property theft or espionage against the US military or against our intelligence agencies. And then I came out and I went to Wilson Sonsini, and it's a very tech-focused firm. And I sit in San Francisco and I spend my entire time in the Bay Area and I talk to tech firms. And the things that I deal with them are, you know, insider threat, our, you know, IP going out the door because our, you know, own employees stole it, or business email compromise, or, you know, and occasionally a hack with a ransom, we have your data, or how are we dealing with the script kiddies that are constantly trying to do credential stuffing on us. And so that's like one area of the threat picture that just is completely unresolved and is just a massive amount of time. And I would say the other piece, though a little bit closer to where, you know, Phyllis was talking about, is the tech companies looking in at like, what have we created? and what can be done with it. And I think that for a very long time, the tech community was very focused on build, 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 because building is good. Building equals good. And now they're like, oh wait, but now I've created this ginormous monster that I cannot govern, and I can't control how it's being used, whether it's the technology that I created because it's facial recognition or voice recognition or the ability to know everything that you're doing in your house at all times, and what's the impact of that, and how do I secure it, and can I secure it? And so there's a lot of reflecting going on also inside of the tech companies about, have I created the threat?
So kind of continuing on this theme of setting a baseline, we talked a little bit about the threat, but how would, and maybe I'll start, Amanda, with you on this one. How would you kind of describe the state of play when it comes to government and private sector relationships on cybersecurity issues, whether it's in the policy realm? We'll get in the next kind of set of questions to information sharing issues, but maybe you could just kind of describe from your perspective what you see as the current state of the relationship between government and private sector on cybersecurity issues.
Thank you for that, and thanks for the opportunity to be here. And I think it is easy to follow on from where Beth just left off with technology companies, having been in this mode of build, build, build. And I think users of technology also been in a place where absorb, yes, use. Like we like this technology, we like what it does to our lives. I think today we're at this place where technology companies are reflecting, governments are reflecting, and one of the issues is that technology has become so integrated into our daily lives in ways that you have to really stop to think about to really absorb. It's incredible for someone like me, who I work in the cybersecurity policy space, but I'm someone who likes to unplug and disconnect. And recently we were having a conversation internally about what it means to be a digital citizen and to be someone who really lives in the digital world. And I was a little bit pushing back until I really was forced to stop and think about how many ways I do just use technology for everything in my daily life, even when I think I don't. So it's really incredible, just how integrated it is into our daily lives. And I think if you really recognize that from a government perspective, we're really in a place where they're also kind of reflecting now and understanding just how impactful technology has become, and where the role and the responsibility for governments is, where that role and responsibility is for technology companies, and what rules are really going to be meaningful in this new ecosystem. That process of rulemaking, as we know as lawyers, it's incredibly complex. There's a lot of nuance, there's a lot of impact to be kind of thought through, and it takes a lot of time to really get to a place where the law is more mature, right? So I think that's one issue that's just occurring today in the ecosystem. And another major issue, between kind of technology companies and governments is just the nature of what this ecosystem is. We all have heard, this internet is borderless. This is a global ecosystem, and yet, governments are in some ways defined by sovereign borders, and so there's an inherent tension there as well. Just kind of thinking, though, about what I think has in the last couple of years also been positive in governments working with technology companies. From my perspective, a couple of things that I would highlight. One, I think governments are increasingly recognizing that cybersecurity is a public-private partnership. It has to be. Government stakeholders bring a lot of expertise and authority to this space, and so do technology companies. And so we have to work together to figure out what policy is going to make sense and be impactful for this space. And the second example I would just give, and it sort of is related but slightly different and gets a little bit to the comments that were made about the threat. And one of the areas that I think a lot of us in this domain are really recognizing is the increasing sort of offensive activity out of really sophisticated actors, including nation states. And this is something that we as Microsoft have started really talking about for a few years and engaging in conversations for a few years. And we've really seen progress over that time period, from this conversation being one that was kind of a handful of government stakeholders and kind of academics, to one that's moving more into the public domain, and one in which governments are really kind of recognizing that this is a space that they want to engage in. The recent National Cyber Strategy highlighted that from the US government's perspective as well. And I would say also there's an increasing recognition that this is largely a government exercise of defining kind of rules of behavior for governments, but it's also, there's a space for a multi-stakeholder kind of dialogue that's really important there as well. I can just give the example of a couple of years ago, I had the chance to brief the UN group of government experts that was working on kind of thinking about cybersecurity norms of behavior for governments. And I went through my whole presentation and gave a lot of kind of context of our thoughts on what technology companies should be doing, what from our perspective government should be thinking about. And at the end of it, all of the questions were, why are you here? Why are you engaging in this conversation? Like, what are you as a technology company, what do you see your role here as being? Fast forward to now, this fall, we are participating in the Paris Peace Forum that is being launched by the French government and talking about these issues of digital peace, and there's a real recognition that multi-stakeholder engagement on these issues is really important.
So I want to get you into this conversation, Jennifer, as well. Staying on this topic of government, the state of play and the kind of state of relationship between government and the private sector. Wickr occupies a particular realm there, sometimes not always in alignment with government's interests sometimes, I think, or some might say. But even setting aside the more charged issue of encryption that we'll get to, how would you assess kind of the state of play when it comes to the relationship between government and private sector on cybersecurity broadly?
Yeah, I think it's, first of all, thanks for having me, and it's full circle for me because my dad attended this law school many years ago, so it's really cool for me to finally see it, and it's beautiful. But I think that's a great question. I think it really depends on the company. I think just because you have a startup company doesn't mean that you're going to enter into the legal process arena appropriately. Our company is kind of unique. I was brought on from day one because we recognized that there were a lot of different topics that are technology touch that would require some intense policy building from the very get-go. So the first thing that I did was sort of, we call it open the mail. I mean, there are companies out there that are not opening legal process, that are not dealing with these issues, that are legally required to do so. So, I mean, there's so many different ways to approach it, and that's just talking about U.S. process. U.S. process alone is a pretty daunting task for a small company that is, a San Francisco-style streamlined startup company. So first we open the mail. We see what it is. We try to figure out exactly how it lines up with our legal process guidelines. And we ultimately, I think it's a matter of being transparent and collaborative. That's the approach that I think, ironically, the startups are so good at, is being agile. And so the agility there really helps us inform what our process is going to be when we deal with government, which for me is, dealing with everything head on. It may not always be fun. It may suck up a couple hours of my day that I wasn't expecting, but ultimately it's a matter of explaining to government, what you have, what you can provide, how quickly you can provide it, understanding the timeliness of what they're asking for based on their circumstances, and then trying to get them, what it is that you've agreed with your users you're going to turn over. So, I mean, it's really not that complicated when you look at it in that light. But it really does require a level of trust that you have to sort of ease into, where you're really trying to establish points of contact within each agency and some allies. I mean, what I try to do, and I think I'm a little bit unique from a GC point of view because of my background in government, is really establish this allies versus adversarial approach, which is, I'm going to try to do the best I can for you, but I've got to respect my user rights. That's kind of the divide that we have at times, but I've never seen it become contentious because we are trying to meet our legal requirements, and we are also trying to meet the needs of the government. And we are also ultimately most responsible to our users who are trying to protect their privacy. So if you can keep track of all of those things, you've had a pretty good day. It's usually going to be a long day, but it's going to be rewarding.
Jen, I should have asked you to do this at the outset, but for the folks in the audience who may not be familiar with Wickr, can you just give 30 seconds on what the company is and what the service is?
Yeah, for sure. So Wicker is a secure communications platform. What that really means is that it's an app. We have many platforms that it runs on, and it started out as a consumer app that was a free product, and it's really scaled into an enterprise level app that we use to help enterprises control their data. And so that can take the form of a lot of different features that we build in, but ultimately it's a voice and video and messaging platform for consumers and enterprises alike.
And it, correct me if I'm wrong, but in the messaging context, one of the things that has at least initially distinguished it from other apps was the disappearance of the message. So Lisa would text Jennifer on Wicker, and then within a time period that we might set up together, 2 days, 1 week, that message would go away. Right?
Correct. So there is an element of data control in there that encompasses ephemerality, and actually our enterprise product allows for retention. So the ephemerality piece really was instigated with the consumer app with this idea that you're creating these data, hoarding data is not necessarily in people's best interests, but it really evolved into this idea of control, where we do sell quite a few of our enterprise appliances, we call them, where an enterprise can hold in-house data for as long as they desire. But it really was meant to drive the consumer into the seat of the data controller. So yeah, there is a timer that you can apply to any message depending on how long you want to keep it.
I raise that obviously because it's got significant implications for policy issues, for relationship with government, for where the regulatory framework may be going when you talk about the consumer being the controller of data. Obviously, that's a principle that animates, in many respects, the GDPR that we all have heard so much about. So it may be something that folks want to ask about when we get to the questions. Phyllis, did you want to add something? No. I want to stay on this just a little bit longer because your discussion about responding to law enforcement requests, obviously the landscape on that has evolved considerably over the last couple of years. And I wonder, Beth, if I might go to you on that. From the perspective of somebody who now advises companies on how to deal with law enforcement when they do come knocking, how do you deal with this evolving landscape? I don't know, maybe you want to give some folks in the audience some free legal advice, but...
I'm not providing free legal advice. I'm pretty sure our general counsel would be upset about that. So I would say the tech companies are as complicated and as varied as all of us are, right? So I have companies that I work with who very much want to work with law enforcement because, for example, maybe they sell things on the web or they're like an Etsy-like platform, and if people are committing fraud or luring someone somewhere and mugging them, they don't want that on the platform, and they want to turn that over to police immediately and right away, right? And so the question they come to us is like, what's the very minimal legal process we have to have in order to turn this information over? Which is actually an important question because they have obligations to keep some data private, right? Then I have clients that are like, we will never share data with law enforcement, period. And so we have to start the conversation with, okay, that's lovely. What data do you have? Because you don't get to make this decision unilaterally. And so then a lot of it ends up being a very technological conversation about, do you keep data in a way that the government can access it? And are you subject to CALEA or ECPA or any other regulation, right? And here's the way you can store your data and justify your data that you can provide the least amount of information possible. Keep in mind they can still subpoena other things, right? Particularly your own misbehavior. And that's fine too. I mean, that's their platform. They're a VPN, right? It's against their business model to create something that's going to help you. Now, it also comes with consequences. There's going to be like child pornographers all over their network. These are the things that the tech companies are wrestling with. I think the other piece that I would say is a writ large that I didn't anticipate, but I'm seeing more and more, is there's become intermediaries that have become, in a post-Snowden world, none of the tech companies want to look like they're working very closely with law enforcement unless that's their brand, and that's pretty much no one's brand in Silicon Valley, except for Palantir. And so they've become these intermediaries like FireEye or CrowdStrike or all of these cybersecurity companies that are made up of former government people for the most part, who now serve as that intermediary, and you're seeing them get data from the government and pass it to pass it to the tech companies. Then tech companies share information with them, and it gets passed back and forth. And so you do see sharing happening, but it's at an arm's length. So I think particularly if you look at the Facebook and I think later Twitter, Google announcements over Iranian activity on their platform, you'll see FireEye mentioned, and I just read between the lines there.
Something else?
Yeah, please, because I was going to go to you next on information sharing.
So I totally agree, and I was in a tech company before I was in government, so, and you find yourself both doing the research that finds some of these attacks, which is interesting to have then gone into government and said, oh, you guys are seeing these things too, how come, this stuff doesn't get shared, and here we are on this panel. But so you have two hats, right? You're finding the attacks. Sometimes you're finding it on customer networks. Sometimes you're finding things that come from a planet that the mother company also does a lot of sales and manufacturing in, so the mother company says, well, don't publish that research. So there are a lot of forces that the adversaries don't have, that the good guys do have. So you may not want to talk to law enforcement, and as Beth said, you may have to, and there are the right ways to do that. But above all of that, I've always advised people of two things. One is, know who you're going to call way ahead of time. There are thousands of FBI agents and thousands of Secret Service people in cyber alone and in Homeland Security investigations, which is part of ICE, but it's a sort of cyber investigative unit as well as financial crime and internet crime. These guys are good and gals are good. Find somebody you like. If you don't like the first one, there's another one. It's like Forrest Gump's box of chocolates. And as folks move on, find more, because that phone call is really important that you have that person on cell phone access. I tell all of my clients to, and I introduce in some cases, it's all voluntary, but to build relationships, as Jennifer was saying, it's about the relationship you build, because when something happens, that's not the time to pull out the 1-800-whatever app and figure out who in law enforcement you're going to call, because the person you're going to reach, in my experience, is the agent that graduated 3 days ago and is stuck answering the phone and isn't going to be able to get you who you need, who knows you have a great business and a good heart and wants to help you. The second thing is law enforcement does not come in and raid jackets and take all the servers out the back window. Right? They come in to help you. Companies I have a little bit of a different perception of CrowdStrike and FireEye because I grew up in that world before government, but they are actually privatizing some of the role that used to be purely government. So they will go and literally investigate, probably not with a badge and a gun or else they'll get arrested by the real ones, but they generally will go and do as good of a job, I would say technically, as law enforcement will do, and side by side they work. They have great relationships with all the different law enforcement and all over the world. They can help you, together. So, but you are seeing a lot of private sector step in because they have excellent research teams, and that's why we need this public-private sharing conversation. There are things you can do in private sector, places you can go, places you can look, that we could not touch in government and vice versa.
So, great segue into this issue of information sharing, right? In the panoply of cybersecurity buzzwords, information sharing may be right up there. So the first thing I kind of want to do in this part of the conversation is, get some perspectives from all of you guys as to what really does that mean, and perhaps more importantly, from your perspective, either drawing on your prior government service as well as your current positions, what do you think it should mean, right? What does success look like? And I think I'd love to get perspectives from all of you on this. What does success look like when it comes to information sharing between the government and the private sector? Because I will tell you, it's something folks talk a lot about, but it's a little bit like an ink blot, right? It kind of is whatever you think it means. So I'd love to get the range of perspectives on this panel. And maybe I'll start with you, Amanda. Maybe we'll just go down the line on this one.
Sure. Yeah. No. And it's a great question, and it is a very broad topic. So the first thing I might start with is just think about when we talk about information sharing. You can think about the kind of what I think was just discussed about when there's compelled information sharing, right, as well as when there is the need for an operational kind of response and kind of sharing between public and private stakeholders so that there can be kind of a response to a crisis. But there's also kind of other information sharing that I think doesn't always get looped into this conversation, in terms of sharing information about vulnerabilities, sharing information about kind of more strategic long-term thinking about threat actors and operational risk management perspectives. And so there really is kind of a broad range of topics that you can think about in this context. Taking maybe a couple of comments on each of them, from our perspective, that kind of operational risk management or operational kind of collaboration and the information sharing that takes place most effectively in that context is one in which there really is a good strategic partnership where all of those that are contributing information are getting something positive out of it. That kind of creates the most positive mechanism where everyone feels like it's valuable for them to put information in and they're getting something valuable out. And from our perspective, that doesn't always necessarily mean that the most intuitive place. I'm guessing some of you in the audience have heard of ISACs, the Information Sharing and Analysis Centers. Microsoft is actually a participant in the Financial Services ISAC because we think that ISAC is they're quite advanced and there's really good kind of threat information coming out of that ISAC. Some of the other examples, we participate in a number of kind of collaborative groups among other technology companies for kind of sharing vulnerability information. So when there's a need for kind of a multi-vendor response to a vulnerability, or just sharing information when we're working on perhaps developing a patch or a mitigation for a vulnerability, making sure that our partners, antivirus vendors and those sorts of organizations kind of have a heads up, and they are prepared to then kind of implement patch and help our customers implement patches. So there's sharing a kind of vulnerability information as well as patches and mitigations. And then the other example I would just give of, from our perspective, a helpful and successful kind of information sharing example is Microsoft has a government security program in which a lot of governments want to work with a company that has a global footprint and has the ability to kind of track what's going on across the ecosystem. And so we've kind of developed a process that, to the kind of almost our starting point on this panel and thinking about some of the tensions in technology companies and governments working together, we can have a sort of a fair, a neutral process for figuring out how to bring governments into the government security program, and then assess that all of the kind of right protections are in place for any vulnerability or threat information that we would share with them, and then have a process by which we can do that and hopefully inform their kind of risk management activities.
Jen?
Yeah, for us, I think it's a little bit different. We're a zero knowledge system, so information
Explain
sharing.
that, yeah.
Well, so the way that our app works is it's end-to-end encryption and it's device-to-device message delivery. Essentially, we can deliver anything, whether it's voice, video, or text messages. So what we see in the middle is nothing. It's undecipherable. And so that content is not really visible to us. But I think I was just being cute in saying we don't have any information to share. But ultimately, as a responsible tech company, you are trying to rise to a certain level, even as a small, lean startup, of being a good community member, which means you have your bug bounties, you do your security audits, you're trying to establish a baseline for what, having an app that is being trusted to deliver message material responsibly does. And so within that community, we try to stay very active with, EFF, all the organizations that really are protecting user rights. But then on the other side of that too, the information sharing that takes place with government is equally important. I love it when government agencies invite me to go, get, I don't want to use the word brainwash, but I guess I just said, sit amongst them for, a day or two and try to understand what their problems are, because that really helps me try to figure out who's on the platform. Again, with a zero knowledge system, you're not seeing that content, so you're really just understanding sort of circumstantially what's taking place there. Or you could have tipsters who are saying, hey, there's a bad actor on your platform, here's their user ID, do something about it. And then the question of what you do about it is a whole nother sort of set of issues that you try to figure out. So when we see bad actors, we try to always take action, and sometimes that means collaboration with organizations like NCMEC that help with the exploitation of children, where we as a provider can look at content and represent to them that content is illicit and help them with their investigations, et cetera. So I think information sharing within a zero knowledge system is probably one of the most interesting experiences I've had in my legal career. But it's crucial, because without it, we're kind of operating in a vacuum. And I think ultimately we want to rise to the appropriate level of responsibility as a company.
So I'm struck by this, right? Because, Beth's perspective about the posture that a lot of tech companies have, and I saw it when I was in government, of not wanting to be seen as helping government, although to my mind and in my experience, these were all patriotic citizens and leaders of companies that they didn't want to see being used for illicit activity, whether it's terrorism or child pornography or trafficking, you name it. But they also had another consideration, which is their reputational issues with their user base. So I'm curious, just from you, Jen, as to how you see, is what Beth said, is that your perception too, that companies, and I agreed that it's not a monolith, but generally speaking, is there that same sense of not wanting to be perceived as outwardly helping the government, even though perhaps behind the scenes you're willing to do so?
I mean, I think helping the government means different things. I mean, in my experience, it really means just meeting that baseline of responsibility of responding to that process and getting the lines of communication open and making sure you're doing everything you can do within the limits of your technology. That example I used of opening the mail was actually a term that was given to me at a DEA conference where they literally, told me that there are companies that just let the subpoenas stack up, which blows my mind, because when I get a subpoena, I don't sleep. I want to figure out what it is and start working on it.
Good guidance at a law school.
Yeah.
Don't ignore the subpoena.
Open your mail.
None of these companies have lawyers, Lisa.
That's the
Lawyers
difference.
hire number 273. After the VC says you have to have a lawyer.
Yeah, I think
Good
that's
point.
the difference. I think our company is a little different because we have several former U.S. cyber czars on our advisory board, and we were sort of founded with this idea of being an agnostic privacy provider. I think if there was something different than that was driving it, monetization, et cetera, and you're trying to create a brand that has some sense of wanting to, provide something that's stacked purely in favor of the consumer, then that might be a bit different. But I actually have no problem trying to make sure people understand that if there is something going on that government wants or needs, like, I want to know what it is. They might not get it, but I want to know what they're thinking.
Great.
So if I can sort of jump in, I think Jennifer is like the model of GC that everyone in government wants. I would say what information sharing sounds like in Silicon Valley is deafening silence. I moved out there, the number of times I've met, and like our company, you can go on our website, you can see the like brand name companies that we represent, right? They'd be like, you're the first person I've ever met who works in national security. The FBI reached out to me and said, can we give you a security clearance? Because there's clients that you have that we want to talk to, and there's no one else who has a security clearance. Like, these are not normal things. This is not something, in DC, there's like 8,000 former government lawyers going, please give me a security clearance, I really need it for my job. Like, this is not something that normally happens. And it's not just a one-way street. Like, it's really, like, there's InfraGard, and that's happening, but that's like the stuff that's coming out through InfraGard. The big tech companies, they know that already. They're seeing it on their platforms. They're very sophisticated. And so that more sophisticated conversation, it's not happening. It's stuck on the East Coast. So one, come out to California and practice law. Seriously, I'm hiring. And two, it's the same vice versa, right? We can all say, oh, we're all like, we love the government, we want to share information. Just look at Spectre and Meltdown. These are the biggest cybersecurity threats that tech companies faced. 6 months. They talked among themselves about how to fix this, and no one picked up the phone and called DHS. And I don't understand why Congress isn't investigating that, and I don't understand why DHS isn't mea culping on that. Like, this is public knowledge that this is failing. It's not working from my perspective. Sorry to be the provocative one on the but it's not like I'm out there and I feel like it's a completely, I mean, when the election happened, I was like, oh, you live in a bubble, you're in DC. I was like, I don't live in a bubble, I can see the whole world. Then I moved to Silicon Valley and I'm like, yes, I do live in a bubble. This is a real bubble, and government hasn't penetrated it. It's become a nuisance that they have to pay attention to, but it's not become a partner.
Enter the leader of the partnership from the federal government side, up until a few years ago, Phyllis Schneck.
And I ran the InfraGard program for a while too. It's just frightening. There are a lot of efforts, right? And it's culture, right? Private sector is different from government. West Coast is very different from East Coast. I think we've made some progress, right? I have met GCs when one used to work with me in my private sector life that said, because I said, I want us to share this data with that FBI agent. It will help them. And he said, this is not the way that we work.
Phyllis, lean
I'm
closer.
sorry, okay. And so I had a general counsel in a company I worked with before government, and we found something. We wanted to share it with the FBI. We had a relationship through me, and our general counsel said, well, that's not the kind of law that I'm familiar with. I actually flew him to Washington. Well, he paid, but we all went to Washington and met with the national security folks at the FBI. And once he had those personal relationships, this is one case, this does not scale, right? But he was the GC of a very, very large company. And so what they did going forward is they said, we'll be able to share information like this if it helps. Give us, he actually said these words, bring me a subpoena. Because that way, he was able to tell our customers, I was forced. I asked to be forced, but this was the right thing to do. I didn't just push out data. And it wasn't personal data. It didn't identify any customers. It literally showed an attack that we saw because we had so much presence all over the world because of our hardware that we saw things coming together. And yet, it was not in our charter, or we didn't have to share it, so he didn't want to be the one who gave it up. I think and that's happening more and more. If you have the right relationship, you can get the paperwork you need to be helpful. I think the second thing is there are a lot of efforts, and this comes before I was in government, but there are a lot of efforts where they're taking people like you, Jennifer, and others into these meetings. I like the word brainwash, it's pretty cool. But to show what the real problem is. In some cases, they're reading them on one day. You get a clearance for one day. So you never ever speak of that again, but these people go home with, wow, if I see that, or wow, I might do something about it, or I might be more willing to go to the mat and go to my lawyers and say, that is going to hurt us and every company that looks like us, or that hardware flaw, we really shouldn't sit on it for 6 months, et cetera. So it may be a one-by-one effort, but this is what we're up against because we built really good technology. Our computers are getting so good that if we make them faster and keep them the same size, they will melt. That's a fact. And all of that technology can either make it great or it can make it great for the adversary. And what I learned in government is there's a lot of work being done in the intelligence community. There's a lot of work being done to declassify that and push it out to groups like this and others so we can all use it. But that's your strength in cyber and government, to take that and make it actionable. The strength of private sector is to take that and push it out to customers and make products better. And our adversaries dance in the streets because they know that we don't put those things together and that we've had this conversation for 20 years.
So I want to kind of take some of the themes that we've talked about in terms of government relationships and information sharing and kind of perceptions of each of the other, and raise kind of one of the elephants that's in the room of topics on cybersecurity issues, but more broadly in the tech industry, and that's content moderation, right? Because that's an area where government and the private sector, I saw it in my former life, discussions about ISIS abusing social media platforms and what should be the relationship and work, collaborative or otherwise, between government and the private sector on that issue. So I want to delve into that a little bit before I open it up for questions. So hopefully folks are stockpiling their questions, which we'll get to in a minute. And there are microphones up for that purpose. So let's spend a minute, if we could, on this question of content moderation and the roles and responsibilities as between government and tech companies. I think we've seen an evolving landscape on this. A few of you have referenced NCMEC, right? The National Child, I'm going to get the acronym wrong, but Child Exploitation Center. Basically, it's a holder of and stockpiler of data and images that are provided to it by law enforcement and others of child pornography images, so that they can help work in a public-private partnership to take that down and have it not be circulating on the internet. And that was an early space of content moderation, quite frankly, right? Between where the private sector and government actually, I think, have executed some good playbooks, if you will, as to how to moderate content in that space. That's an example of where some of that, I think, is working pretty well. We've seen an evolution in terms of ISIS content and terrorism content, and the particular challenges that both government and the private sector and tech companies face there. And now, of course, we are all inundated by the issue of, quote, fake news, or really, I think more accurately, disinformation, misinformation. So we see kind of a spectrum of the challenge here when it comes to relationships between government and private sector on these issues. And I'm curious as to the perspectives on the panel as to how we're doing on that, B, where should we be drawing the line? What are the responsibilities for companies and the government in this space, from a policy, regulation, and frankly, corporate stewardship perspective? Let me start with you on that, Amanda.
Sure. I think it's an interesting topic to move into next, because I think there are a lot of parallels between the conversation we were just having about sort of privacy and ensuring data of individuals is not just handed over all the time without really good kind of legal process in place, and so the kind of balance that technology companies are dealing with in terms of wanting to protect the privacy rights of their users, but also actually wanting to be helpful to law enforcement and other kind of government purposes. I think obviously that same tension kind of sits in this space, where you want to protect the kind of speech rights of the users of your technology platform, but you also have other compelling things in your mind of ensuring security and not kind of inciting violence and that sort of thing. And so I think from our perspective, this is a really important area where technology companies do have a responsibility. And as I kind of said at the outset, I think some of these things they're just difficult, and it takes time to figure out where the kind of right lines to draw are. But from our perspective, Bing Ads is a place where we have some kind of rules about what kind of content we are or are not okay with. Like, we restrict ads that have content that includes hate speech, that advocates for violence, actually that interestingly, like, that exploits kind of sensitive events to drive traffic. So we have those kind of rules in place, and for the most part, they're consistent kind of across jurisdictions. And then there are, on top of those consistent across jurisdictions, a couple of sort of jurisdiction-specific rules, like Brazil doesn't allow content about elections and ads, or Germany randomly does not allow content about Scientology. So, there are those rules in place, and I think the question that's going to probably have an evolving answer is, are those lines being drawn in the right place?
I think,
Yeah, go
sorry,
ahead, Beth.
I'll jump in. So I think NCMEC is a great place to start, because tech understands tech, right? And what they can do well is scale when it's tech. So the way NCMEC works is that you get a stockpile of child pornography, CP, and then you hash it. And so when your systems detect the same hash of this image, one-to-one match, you know it's CP, right?
Can you just explain hash, just?
So a hash is just a way of encrypting the data so that you can look at it sort of in the same, compare apples to apples, right? It's just,
Fingerprint, if you will.
yes, thank you.
Sure.
And so if you look at Facebook, Facebook tried to do this, Alex Stamos, their former CISO, tried to do this with revenge porn. And he said, we can keep revenge porn off of Facebook, but you have to give us your nude photos, the ones that your boyfriend or girlfriend put up there that you didn't allow. And there was outrage. Outrage. How could you stockpile all these nude photos? We don't trust you. Well, this is the way the technology worked, and that was something they could apply. Right? Then you take an image of ISIS. Well, that image of ISIS could be a news article or it could be a propaganda article, and the technology can't make that decision. And then take a disputed terrorist group. Take the YPG. The YPG is our allies in the fight against ISIS. The YPG is a terrorist organization in Turkey. All these tech companies operate both in the United States and in Turkey, and in some cases have employees in Turkey they need to protect. Is an image of the YPG fighting against ISIS in Iraq an image of terrorism or not? Do you want a tech company making those decisions? Most of these people have never had a humanities course in their entire life. Okay, so, and then there's no winning. So take fake news. Take what Russia did on their platforms. The pieces that the media has emphasized is, oh, well, they created this group, and they created this leftist group, and this right group, and they convinced them to come and protest against each other. Okay, that's like the sexy thing because they created something and made something happen. 99% of the content was pre-existing content that they just promoted. They just took other people's stuff and retweeted it. So it's okay when an American says something completely racist, but when Russia says something completely racist, it's a problem. Oh, it's okay when an American says, you know, Medicare for all, but then when a Russian or says it on there, it's a problem. Like, these decisions, they don't scale. I don't know that tech companies are the deciders that we want to be having, but the issue is much more complicated than, oh, this image, everyone agrees, under 17, under 18, nude, done, off the platform, right? It's a much more complicated problem, and I think that's what they're really struggling with.
Anything to add?
Just, it goes back to the relationship. I think when companies do struggle with this, they have to be able to go to, I mean, way back in my career, we had a service in a former company where we blocked what we thought was cyber bad content, and we ended up with a stockpile of our own of child pornography on the server, and that's possession's a felony. So we're lucky that we had the relationship to literally call the FBI and say, what do you do with this, right? And they took care of it. But without that relationship, it can't sit there. We knew it wasn't our responsibility to try to figure out what to do, and we knew we couldn't keep it there. And I think, you know, to Beth's point, tech companies, we took a little bit of humanities. You have to graduate. You know, you don't have, your head isn't there. Your head is how to make things faster and cooler. And so I think you're exactly right. I mean, some of these decisions have to get made at another level, but it goes back to the relationship. You have to know to go get that information.
Great. I think we've got time for some questions. I want to be respectful of folks' time in the next session, but we do have time for a few questions. What I would just do is ask folks to come to the microphone there that's there in the center, and please do try and keep it to an actual question so we can get the perspectives from our panelists. Sir?
Yellow. Isn't it just another case of making lemons out of lemonade? I mean, data localization is big around the world. Here in America, not so much. I mean, if we had more control of the data that's being transcribed, half the issues that you're bringing up wouldn't necessarily be issues. But America lacks in that kind of resolve. If we had more control of the data that's being transcribed, it wouldn't be such a big deal, right?
Okay, so I think the question's around data localization and whether or not we ought to have some of those requirements here in this country, or if I could read in a little bit to the question whether the consumer should have more control over his or her data. Anybody want to chime in on that? Beth?
So one of my biggest frustrations is that cybersecurity regulation has been used to mask what is really interest in the government and access to law enforcement information, right? Data localization does not protect you as a user, the fact that your data is in your country versus another country, because some countries have better laws than others when it comes to service of process, and sometimes it depends on what nationality you are, right? And so it's not, it's a distraction and becomes a fight for tech companies to engage in without actually making them be any better about protecting your data and where it's stored. It doesn't matter if it's here in Ireland. If they haven't patched their systems, your data is going out the door to China. Okay, so that doesn't, I think that's a big misconception. So I'll stop there.
Okay. Other questions or any? Yeah, go ahead.
Hi, thanks for being here. I wanted to ask if you would elaborate a little bit more on how you work, how the US government works with some other countries, since there really is no international body, as far as I know, that controls cybersecurity, but a lot of these issues are international. How does the US government work with the governments of other countries, and how do you see that proceeding in the future? Thank you.
I'm actually happy to take it. Look, it's a real gap, actually. I would say a few things. One, most recently, I think we've taken a step back in terms of how our government is organized on this issue. The cybersecurity coordinator job that used to work actually under me in the White House has been removed. It was a role that was played by a guy by the name of Rob Joyce, who many of us know, who's a career professional at the National Security Agency, really a very accomplished guy. But that role has now been jettisoned from the White House, and I think that's and that has previously also been a place where other governments could look to as a voice in policy issues, cybersecurity policy issues in the White House, who would help drive the discussion in the U.S. government. And so the lack of that role, or the removal of that role, I think is a real mistake in terms of cybersecurity policy leadership. I would say the same thing about the removal of the ambassador for, basically the ambassador post at the State Department for cyber issues. So the short answer to your question is the places where there have been clear interlocutors for foreign governments I see a weakening of that in our government today.
And at the operational level, so at the sort of the people that share the technical event level, it's a little bit, when I was in, I don't know that, I haven't been in a couple of years, but it was very strong then. Even countries you don't think we get along with, when something bad happens, so the CERT, the Computer Emergency Readiness Team, there are probably hundreds of these. They're popping up all over, and they're good technical people for the most part, but they are sharing information. And our CERT in the, Lisa mentioned the NCIC earlier, the National Cybersecurity and Communications Integration Center, which is sort of like the operations for all of the cleanup on Aisle 9 across all the federal agencies except DoD and the private sector. About a 700-person operation, watch floor, 50 people, and another one in another state. So you have literally the big screens and the things coming up right at you. All of that communicates with about 300 other CERTs worldwide all the time. So if something happens, techies speak to other techies. It's a thing, we all get along. So when something happens, information does get shared. Now when something happens that's politically charged, you really have to sort of, work at it a little more. Sometimes it gets a little tricky because the policy folks get involved, and when it's clunky at the top, it gets harder at the lower level. But there really have been, I think that the years that we were in really built some on top of years before us, but really strengthened the infrastructure to get that plumbing of a real technical information sharing. And other countries help us, and we help other countries. I think a great example is when the lights went out for 500 million people in Ukraine a couple of years ago, winter of 15. We had folks from Homeland Security, because we had a relationship with them, the government of Ukraine called us. And we had folks wheels up to Kiev right before Snowzilla came into Washington so that we could get them out. And they got the lights back on by turning on the physical equipment, because the electronic equipment, you've had a system administrator go into your laptop and you see the cursor go around and you're not moving it, someone's fixing it for you. This was part of the adversary went in and used similar software to turn the breaker from on to off in that case. And so our guys came in based on that relationship, and on the technical sharing, we actually put bodies on the ground there to turn their lights back on. So there are some really good relationships, but it needs some help. Again, everything comes from the top, and so that could be so much strengthened, I think even more.
I think if we've got one more question, we've got time for that. Yes, ma'am.
Hello, I'd like to know your opinion about hardware backdoors and regulations of hardware backdoors, because users do not want them, government wants them.
Anyone?
Why is
Jen?
everyone looking at me? Yeah, I think you summed it up. Yeah, I mean, the backdoor question is a very tough question, and it's a very technical question because it's the question about what a backdoor is. And so when you get into the linguistics of what it means to change something such that it is a backdoor, the law, says one thing, and then it's a matter of interpretation for that particular set of circumstances. I think talking about legal process, like you get into that topic of backdoors pretty quickly when you're served with legal process that the technical architecture of your platform can't allow for. And then it becomes a conversation of how hard is it for you to do that? And that's when I say, hold on, let me go get our CTO. And that's the thing. It's like if you're saying that any change at all is a backdoor, then you can't require us to do that. So I think it becomes very fact specific. That's why going back to the idea of collaboration, like if you know that it's just like any form of litigation. If you know what opposing counsel is asking for, and you can find a mutually beneficial way to get that objective served, or to say this is not a fight worth fighting for you, and here's why, and explain to them, all of the reasons why it's not going to be compelling, then you can avoid all of that. I think when you force the issue of backdoor, you've got to get through all of those fact-specific circumstances, and you've got to get that sort of conversation back and forth going so that they know that if they were to push the issue, this is what you come armed with, and this is who you are, and this is who you're rolling with, and they probably shouldn't mess with you. But that's the posture that I think this backdoor issue is taking. I mean, that's just me stating it, from my standpoint, and then you've got the whole global standpoint on this. But ultimately, I think for me, and this is perfect because I kind of wanted to get this across before we ended, but I think it's so fascinating that, we really are trying to protect our children and this next generation from all of the threats that are out there. Like the idea of, warning your kid about the van driving slowly down the street, with the candy, like that is the internet, and that is like the apps. Like that's what our kids grew up knowing. And I mean, this idea of like cyber breach fatigue is really like streaming into our kids, where they see every day, like, oh, I'm on Facebook, I just got violated. Those kinds of things are not new to that generation. And so the backdoor issue really plays into that, because we're trying to like preserve the ability to keep kids safe by not, deliberately putting vulnerabilities into systems that can be that backdoor for the dirty van. That's kind of how I see it from my view, but there may be more intelligent ways to state
No, I
that.
totally agree. I'll
Closing
make
word.
this really, really short. When people think backdoors, they always think the government's collecting. I always joke with my friends. I sit at their dinner table. We have a grill outside, and there's Alexa. And I say, we don't think about what these things are listening to or doing, or when you put your phone in airplane mode, really? I mean, it may not be transmitting like it should be or could be, but we don't know exactly what's coming in or out of these devices, and we don't know, my good friend said to me at her own dining table, oh, it only listens when I say Alexa. Well, then how does it know you said Alexa, right? So we don't think about where other ways are of data going in and out that we don't control. So a little bit of I think private sector does some of has to be part of the backdoor conversation as well, and take as much responsibility for having or not having that when we think about what government wants also. There's a lot of data getting collected about all of us that we're not really being told about.
All right, on that note, I want to thank our panelists for giving us their expertise and their perspective.